Dr. Eleanor Graves arrived at Blackthorn Asylum under an overcast sky, the building looming before her like a monument to forgotten horrors. The ivy-clad walls bore the weight of time, and shattered windows glared at her like vacant eyes. She had come to investigate the lingering rumors of shadowy figures in the halls and chilling whispers in the night. As she crossed the threshold, a stale, musty scent filled her lungs. The asylum had been waiting. The creak of the heavy door echoed through the grand foyer, where peeling wallpaper revealed hidden layers of decay and forgotten memories. She took a deep breath and pressed forward. Inside, the air hung heavy with dust and decay. Eleanor moved through the abandoned corridors, past rusting gurneys and shattered light fixtures. The silence felt oppressive, pressing against her ears with a weight that made it hard to breathe. Faded patient files lay strewn across the floor, their pages brittle and crumbling at her touch. The names, though barely legible, were familiar, ghosts of stories her father once told her when he worked here years ago. Then came the sound, soft, almost imperceptible, the distant squeak of wheels rolling down the hall. Eleanor froze, gripping her flashlight tightly. That night, Eleanor set up her research equipment, recorders, cameras, and motion sensors, to document any signs of activity. As darkness crept through the broken windows, the asylum came alive in unsettling ways. A distant, rhythmic tapping echoed through the halls, like the ticking of an unseen clock. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls, contorting into grotesque shapes that dissolved as soon as she looked directly at them. She reminded herself that fear was a symptom of the unknown, but deep down, something primal told her she was not alone. The next morning, an old groundskeeper, Mr. Hawthorne, arrived with a grim expression. His weathered face and sunken eyes spoke of sleepless nights and memories better left forgotten. "This place doesn't forget," he muttered, avoiding Eleanor's gaze. "If you stay, they'll come for you too." He handed her a rusted key, his fingers trembling. "Lock yourself in at night. It's the only way to stay safe." Eleanor tried to ask more, but he simply turned away, whispering prayers under his breath as he disappeared into the mist. Eleanor's recordings revealed more than she'd expected, whispers in languages she couldn't place, footsteps echoing down empty corridors, and faint strains of music from an old, unseen source. Reviewing the footage late one evening, she caught glimpses of figures lurking just beyond the frame, their forms blurred and shifting. One moment, a face would stare directly at the camera, eyes hollow, mouth twisted in a silent scream, only to vanish the next. The asylum wasn't empty. It never had been. Digging deeper into the asylum's archives, Eleanor uncovered horrific details of the patient's suffering: electroshock therapy gone too far, chemical treatments that left them mute and broken, and endless isolation. Each file read like a confession, an admission of guilt from the institution itself. The spirits roaming the halls weren't simply lost souls. They were prisoners, trapped in the place of their torment, seeking justice, or perhaps vengeance. While exploring the lower levels, Eleanor found herself trapped in the hydrotherapy room. The stagnant water rippled without reason, and a ghostly whisper curled around her ears, whispering her name. She turned sharply, but saw only her distorted reflection in the water's surface. The door slammed shut and panic gripped her. She fumbled with the rusted key, her fingers trembling as an unseen force pressed against the door. When she finally escaped, the hallway was deathly silent, as if nothing had happened, but something had. Determined to understand the spirit's intent, Eleanor scoured through the asylum's journals and blueprints. A hidden notebook from a former nurse detailed a failed escape attempt and spoke of a terrifying figure known only as the Warden. The deeper she read, the more she understood. Something was keeping the spirits trapped, feeding on their misery. A heavy realization settled in her chest. She was now part of their story. The hauntings grew more intense. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed without warning, and the air thickened with an oppressive weight. Deep scratches appeared on the wooden floors, spelling out a single word: leave. The entity she had read about, the Warden, made its presence known. A tall, faceless figure with eyes that burned like embers. It stalked the corridors, its footsteps echoing behind Eleanor wherever she went. She knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. She had to end it. Mr. Hawthorne finally revealed the asylum's darkest secret, a hidden basement where patients were left to rot, their suffering ignored. Armed with the rusted key, Eleanor descended into the depths, her flashlight flickering as she uncovered rows of decayed cots and rusted restraints. The air grew thick with whispers, each one pleading for justice. Faded graffiti lined the walls, desperate messages scratched into the peeling paint by forgotten hands. The deeper she ventured, the stronger the sensation of being watched became. Shadows flitted along the edges of her vision, and the musty air felt charged with anticipation. As Eleanor sifted through the remains of the asylum's past, she stumbled upon an old medical file wedged between two rotting beams. Inside were patient testimonies, filled with chilling descriptions of the torment they had endured. Flickering lanterns, phantom cries in the night, and a malevolent presence they called the Warden. With every word she read, Eleanor felt the walls closing in, the voices growing louder, pressing in against her psyche. The spirits were not just lingering, they were reliving their pain over and over again. While exploring a decrepit operating theater, Eleanor's flashlight died, plunging her into suffocating darkness. A raspy voice whispered her name, and something cold brushed against her arm. Fear clawed at her throat as shadows swirled around her, taking form, a grotesque, elongated figure with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. Frozen with terror, Eleanor steadied herself and whispered, "I know what happened to you. I can help." The figure halted, its ghastly face contorting in a mixture of rage and sorrow. Desperate, Eleanor proposed a ritual of remembrance, lighting candles, reading their names aloud, and acknowledging their suffering. The spirits raged against the offer, the walls trembling with their anger, but she stood firm, determined to end their torment. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and an unseen force seized her, pressing her against the rusted metal table. Gritting her teeth, she recited the names from the journal, each syllable punctuated by spectral wails. The grip released, and the darkness seemed to recede, though the malevolent presence remained. As the ritual reached its peak, the asylum shuddered one last time. The spirits' wails grew softer, and one by one, their forms faded into the darkness. Eleanor felt the heavy weight of their anguish lift, though the air remained charged with lingering sadness. In the eerie silence that followed, she realized the asylum's power had waned, but its story would remain forever in her heart. With the spirits appeased, Eleanor left the basement, locking the door behind her. She stepped into the cold dawn, Blackthorn Asylum looming silently behind her. The weight on her chest had lessened, but she knew better than to believe it was truly over. The air around the asylum was thick with an uneasy stillness, as if it was holding its breath. A figure stood in the window, watching, unmoving. Eleanor stared back, a chill running down her spine. She whispered a farewell, uncertain if the asylum was finally at peace or merely waiting for the next intruder. Back home, Eleanor found no solace. Her once cozy apartment felt stifling, the walls closing in with each passing day. Shadows seemed darker, whispers lingered longer, and objects moved in the night, subtle, but enough to gnaw at her sanity. She pored over her notes obsessively, hoping to make sense of what she had experienced. Had she truly freed the spirits, or had she become their new anchor? The journal she recovered from the asylum sat on her desk, untouched, yet radiating a strange energy, as if it yearned to be read again. Despite the unease, Eleanor refused to abandon her mission. She wrote articles, recorded interviews, and spoke at local universities, determined to bring attention to the forgotten souls of places like Blackthorn. But with each piece she published, she felt an unseen force pressing against her, an invisible weight of expectation. Her dreams were filled with visions of the asylum's decayed corridors and the faces of those she had left behind. Some nights, she awoke to find words scrawled across her walls in her own handwriting. "Remember us." Eleanor returned to Blackthorn one final time, standing at the edge of the overgrown grounds. The asylum was nothing more than a crumbling ruin now, yet it still exuded an air of solemnity. She placed a small plaque in front of the collapsed entryway, inscribed with the names of those she had discovered in the journal. "You are remembered," it read. She lingered for a moment, hoping to feel a sense of closure, but instead, she felt watched. With a final glance at the skeletal remains of the building, she turned and walked away, uncertain if she was leaving the past behind or if it was following her.